July 5th, 1943. Kursk, Western Russia. Dawn had barely broken when the sky above the steppe thundered, not with storms, but with artillery. The horizon flickered orange as German 88mm guns and Soviet howitzers exchanged fire across the endless fields of wheat and dust. Smoke rolled over the land, blotting out the morning sun. Inside his Panzer IV, Unteroffizier Karl Meissner wiped the sweat from his brow, though the day had only just begun. His hands trembled on the control levers as he listened to the crackling radio. Orders barked through static. Forward, crush the Soviet line. The Battle of Kursk, Operation Citadel, had begun, and in front of Karl, the earth moved. Through the narrow vision slit, he saw dark shapes cresting the ridgeline. At first, he thought they were hills. Then they moved, rolling forward with monstrous intent. Dozens of T-34s, their sloped armor glinting under the rising sun, charged across the open ground. Behind them followed the heavier KV-1s, engines roaring like angry gods. Mein Gott, how many of them are there? Whispered his loader, Schmidt, clutching a shell as though it were his last. The German tanks opened fire. A Panzer III to their left spat flame. Its shell punched into the lead T-34, bursting it apart in a spray of fire and molten steel. But for every Soviet tank that burned, 3 more appeared from the haze. The Soviet advance didn't slow. It was as if the earth itself was birthing armor without end. The ground shook as the German lines braced themselves, realizing they weren't facing a single armored division. They were facing the industrial soul of the Soviet Union itself. Inside his tank, Karl could feel it already. This battle would not be won with precision or courage. It would be fought through exhaustion, attrition, and terror. The roar of engines filled his ears as he pushed the throttle forward. The Panzers rolled into hell. The German line surged ahead, treads grinding the soil into mud and smoke curling into the morning haze. The air was thick with the stench of oil, cordite, and burning rubber. Unteroffizier Karl Meissner's Panzer IV jolted violently as a near miss from a Soviet shell erupted beside them, showering the tank with debris. Inside, the crew's nerves stretched thin. The gunner, Feldwebel Kruger, steadied the cannon. Target, T-34, 11 o'clock. Range 400 meters. Fire, Karl barked. The cannon roared, rocking the Panzer backward. Through the scope, Kruger saw the Soviet tank stagger, its turret bursting into flames. But before they could celebrate, another T-34 thundered into view, followed by 2 more. It never ended. All across the steppe, the German panzers were drowning in a sea of steel. What had started as an offensive was quickly turning into a desperate stand. Soviet tank formations emerged from the smoke in waves. Organized, relentless, perfectly timed. The Germans destroyed dozens, but the Soviets seemed to have hundreds more. In the distance, Tiger I tanks, Germany's pride, joined the fight. Their 88mm guns tore through Soviet armor like paper. Each shot was thunder itself, echoing across the plain. Yet even the mighty Tigers couldn't stop the tide. For every T-34 burning, 3 more crested the horizon, advancing without fear, without pause. Radio chatter filled Karl's headset. Panic, broken commands, screams. They're everywhere. We're surrounded. The Panzer jolted again. A shell struck their right flank, denting the armor, sparks flying across the interior. The loader screamed, clutching his shoulder. Karl shouted for him to stay down, forcing the tank into reverse, smoke trailing behind them. Outside, the battlefield had turned into chaos. Tanks colliding, infantry scrambling for cover, air strikes howling overhead. German soldiers stared in disbelief as the Soviet armor seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. For the first time, Karl felt something cold in his chest. The realization that no matter how many Soviet tanks they destroyed, there would always be more. The machine of the East was awake, and it wasn't stopping. Smoke curled over the battlefield like a storm that would never clear. The ground trembled beneath the endless advance of Soviet armor. As noon approached, visibility dropped to nothing. The sun was swallowed by the smoke of burning tanks, and the air shimmered with heat and ash. Karl Meissner's Panzer IV crouched behind the charred remains of another tank, its engine idling low. Inside, the crew was silent, each breath heavy with exhaustion and fear. Through his periscope, Carl spotted a line of T-34s pushing through a shallow valley. They moved with grim purpose, their turrets rotating in perfect unison, guns searching for German silhouettes. The Soviet tactics had changed. No longer were they charging recklessly. Now they advanced with precision and discipline, one wave suppressing while the next flanked. "Load AP," Carl ordered. Kruger slammed a shell into the breech, and the gun fired again. The recoil jolted their bones. The shell struck T-34 dead on, the explosion echoing across the plain. But before they could shift targets, another Soviet tank fired. The round hit just short of the Panzer, sending a blast of dirt and metal shards against the hull. "Driver, reverse, reverse." The gears screamed as the Panzer backed into a shallow depression. The crew panted, sweating, coughing, shouting over the noise. Outside, tracer rounds streaked through the haze like fiery needles. A voice crackled on the radio. Oberst Hoff, commander of the 4th Panzer Army. His tone was strained but sharp. "Hold your ground. Reinforcements are coming. We must break through to Prokhorovka." But the truth was becoming clear to everyone on the line. The Soviets weren't breaking, they were building. Every hour, new tanks, artillery, and infantry poured into the fight. The Germans were hitting a wall made of men, steel, and determination. Karl's heart pounded as another wave rolled in. The steppe was alive with motion. Thousands of tanks, dust clouds stretching miles wide. It was no longer a battle between armies. It was a war machine grinding itself to dust. Inside the Panzer, Karl glanced at his wounded loader. The man's eyes were hollow, staring past the steel walls as if he could already see how this would end. Somewhere out there, beyond the roar of cannons and the screams of engines, the Soviet tide had already begun to swallow the German dream of victory. And want to see what happens next? Click the video on the right to watch part 2.